hppodcraft.com.
What was that you started telling me the other day, about a monkey's paw or something, Morris? Nothing, said the soldier hastily. Leastways, nothing worth hearing. Monkey's paw? Said Mrs. White curiously. Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him again. To look at, said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket. It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it on the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major. A very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. His manners were so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter had jarred somewhat. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him the way middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. I have, he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. And did you really have 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Persisted the old lady. The first man had 3 wishes, yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death.
That was an excerpt from the first chapter of the W.W. Jacobs classic, The Monkey's Paw.
And you're joining us here on the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast.
Here at hppodcraft.com, I'm Chad Pfeiffer.
And I'm Chris Lackey.
And we're glad to be back.
Yeah, it's exciting to be doing this story. This is kind of an old favorite of mine. I haven't read it in a few years, but I'm excited to get on it.
In supernatural horror and literature, in that introduction that we covered, Lovecraft really briefly touches on this story when he's referring to how writers of varying inclinations nevertheless find themselves once in a while writing a weird tale. It's true that W.W. Jacobs was best known in his time, at least, as a humorist. I think this is probably, though, his most famous work of fiction as far as, standing the test of time.
Yeah, this is the thing that everybody remembers or at least has heard of. Nobody has really, well, I'm sure some people have, but most people haven't heard of his other stories.
Right. So, but is there anything, what do we know about him?
Well, he was born in London in 1863 to a poor family. He started publishing in the 1890s in satirical magazines, and he was working for the civil service, post office, savings bank, and he left by 1899 because he was making enough writing.
Yeah, I think he did pretty well later. He wrote all sorts of novellas. Most of his stories were published in The Strand, which was a really popular magazine, which I believe lasted all the way into the 1950s. Mm-hmm. But that's where he made most of his money, is doing these sort of one-off stories for The Strand. Novellas he's known for, one is called At Sandwich Port from 1902, Dialstone Lane, 1904. I think he was the kind of guy who wrote really broad characters. Mm-hmm. Actually, he's really famous for a bunch of sailors' stories. He had these characters who would, among some of those titles are Captains All, Sailors' Knots, Night Watches. Basically, they were about these really colorful lower middle class sailors who would tell stories about being off at sea and lots of different things, but they were also kind of idiots. A lot of his characters seem to have that kind of Ralph Cramden quality where they're schemers, big dreams, but things don't quite work out for them.
Big dreams, limited intelligence.
The characters he's famous for are Ginger Dick, Sam Small, and Peter Russet, who were in Night Watches. Sailors who came back from a long voyage, have lots of money, and then they'd say, okay, we're going to enjoy, our time ashore all these different ways, but all the people that were in the dockland in London would pretty soon, figure out ways to get them to give up their money in different ways.
Con them, scan them, or just make them buy lots of booze or whatever.
Right.
These stories aren't anything like Tom of Finland kind of things, right?
What's that?
You don't know who Tom of Finland is?
No.
I meant that to be as kind of an in-joke for you and I, but now that you don't know who Tom of Finland, he's an artist that I think he drew mostly in the 50s and maybe 60s, and it's homoerotica. of sailors and bikers, and
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
they have
now.
they're very rosy cheeked and look very happy, but they have ridiculously large
right
genitalia, and they're very buff and muscular guys, and they're very comical. I don't know how anybody could take them seriously or find them erotic, but to each their own.
No, I don't think he was into any of that. The Monkey's Paw was in a collection of short stories called The Lady of the Barge, which was from 1902. And the story has been in approximately 70 collections since then.
70? 70?
Yeah, 70. Wow. And I would think more than that even. And you had mentioned in the last episode that you were familiar with it from The Simpsons.
Right, yeah.
It was parodied on there. Mm-hmm. Stephen King wrote about it in The Dead Zone, An Apt Pupil, and I would say Pet Sematary is pretty much inspired by this story.
Oh, right, yeah. The theme of it, yeah.
Be careful what you wish for, and even down to some of the things that happen in that book. Anyway, I think it's pretty clear, though, when you read this, that Jacobs was a comedy writer. The way that he puts the characters together and the things that they do, it almost feels like a sitcom a little bit.
It all takes place in their front room.
Right.
Pretty much.
There's a lot of theatrical adaptations of the story. I produced one in college. It was really easy to do, and it was exactly like the story because it's already split into 3 acts.
Yeah.
It's easy, lights up, lights down on this one room because all the action takes place in one spot. So, why don't we talk about it? We started out with this domestic scene. We've got our character, Mr. White, who's the father, playing at chess pretty badly with his grown son, Herbert, while the missus looks on.
They're older. They have an adult son who works at the nearby factory.
At the top, the father makes a bad move in the chess game, and he's like trying to distract his son so that he doesn't notice. He's kind of got that total schemer, wide-eyed sitcom character kind of feel to him.
His son does catch it and beats him at it, and then he sort of gets mad and makes excuses, but everybody's still in a good mood, and they're having a good time, and everything's great, and it's a wonderful family, and nothing's going to go wrong. Everything's going to work out great for these people.
It does have that feeling. In fact, the only thing that they complain about, Mr. White is complaining about, is that they live so far out. The path out to their place is a bog, and the road is, muddy and torrential, and there's only 2 houses along the road, so he's like, I guess that means they don't have to take care of the property, that kind of thing. Yeah. Mostly he's complaining because he lost at chess, but he does bring that up, that they're kind of out there. And then they have a guest, Sergeant Major Morris.
No, Sergeant Major Morris, he, for some reason, do you remember The World of Commander McBragg from Rocky and Bullwinkle?
No, is that another gay art thing?
No. No, it's not. Did you ever watch Rocky and Bullwinkle? Were you?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't.
Okay.
I know, this is one of those things I missed out on.
It was one of those segments, there was Peabody and the dog in the time machine and all that stuff. There was all these different kind of segments. One of them was called The World of Commander McBragg, and he was this old English guy, and he would tell adventures to this other kind of nerdy English guy at a gentleman's club. And he would say, this reminds me of the time I was in Kenya and I had to fight 5,000 natives only with a toothpick. And then he would tell these kind of very Adventures of Baron Munchausen kind of stories where it's way over the top and they're big and stuff. And at the end, the guy that would listen to it, he would always have a pun. Like, so he goes, and I killed them all with the toothpick. And then he goes, I guess, sir, that they really got the point. And that would they would laugh. And that's the end of it. And that's how every one of those were. But the character of Sergeant Major Morris reminds me of Commander McBragg.
Oh, I can see it. And they set him up that way. He's the guy that's been over in India and he's seen all sorts of wondrous things, and he's going to come back and regale everybody with these stories because they're never going to go. So as far as they know, everything he's saying is true. I mean, he's this tall tales Smith kind of guy, and he drinks a lot. So they set him down and right away, they've got him at his 3rd glass of whiskey within 3 sentences of his entrance into the house.
The opening block of reading that we had at the beginning takes place at right this point.
Exactly. He's talking a little bit about all of the crazy things that he's, the jugglers and the temples and different things that he's seen in India. And then Mr. White is, what was that you were starting to tell me the other day about the monkey's paw? And then he gets into this story where it's this paw, and if you have it, which he, by the way, does have it on his person.
Yeah.
Little paw dried up to kind of a mummy, and if you have it, you can make 3 wishes. But from the way he says it, it would lead you to believe that maybe those don't work out the way that you want them to.
Right.
So the warning and the message of the entire story is there right away.
The Sergeant Major takes the monkey's paw and he tosses it into the fire.
Yeah, out of nowhere, he just has this moment of like anger towards it and throws it into the fire.
Yeah, Mr. White pulls it out of the fire and says, "Don't do that. No, it's an heirloom. It's special.
If you don't want it, I'll take it."
And he warns him. He tries to say, "You don't want to get involved in this thing," but he still lets him take it. Which if I knew what he knew, I would not let him have it.
Yeah, what do you think motivates him to do that?
Maybe he doesn't really like him very much.
It could be that he doesn't like him very much, or it could be that he wants to get it away.
Maybe there's something that doesn't allow it to be destroyed and has to be given. I mean, this is all conjecture. It doesn't say anything like this in the story, but maybe that's what's going on.
Well, but it is something, because I'm a huge fan of the film version of Pet Sematary. And if you watch that movie, and I guess it's true in the book as well, but Judd, the neighbor that Fred Gwynne plays, it's his fault that all of the tragedy befalls the family.
Yeah.
Just as it is the Sergeant Major's fault right now. And maybe it's just because life is so mundane that if you do have access to magic, even if it's dangerous, you can't help but sharing it with people. I'm not sure. But Judd full well knows. I mean, he knows a boy got buried back in that pet cemetery, came back, killed his father, burned the house to the ground. He knows this has happened. And yet he's still like, well, you need that cat to be resurrected. Let's take him out to that old Micmac burial ground. And later he's like, I shouldn't have introduced you to the secret. Well, why did you?
Why did you do that? For a cat? I mean, the kids will get over the cat. It's not a big deal.
Maybe I just didn't think she was ready for maybe slippers of a man are comfier.
Well, it doesn't say that.
Yeah, he does. The beer of a man is foamier.
That's not what he says. He says, the soil of a man's heart is stonier. Right? That's what he says?
That is what he says.
Okay, that's right, yeah.
Sometimes that is better. Mr. White gives him a couple of bucks for the monkey's paw. They send him off into the night. And then he's got the paw and they're all standing around. Now, Herbert, the son, thinks this is all hilarious.
Yeah, he doesn't believe it's real. He thinks it's just kind of a fun game that they're playing here.
Yeah, and he says, well, you know what? Wish for 200 pounds. You could pay off the house. You could do that at least. Because the father is saying, I don't know what to wish for. It seems I've got all I want. He's actually pretty content. So in that respect, he's not really a schemer.
No.
He's really actually happy with what he has. But the son kind of goads him on to do it. So it's like the son and the father are together, two sides of this kind of personality.
Right.
So he does make the wish. He says, I wish for 200 pounds.
Do you ever wonder what happened to the rest of the monkey or why this particular... I mean, I know Holy Man did something to it, but what's up with the rest of the monkey?
I don't know. If somebody had said, here's a monkey's paw. If you have this, you get 3 wishes. I'd be like, you keep that. I'm going to go rub a whole monkey and get 90 wishes.
I got a theory. I think that the monkey might have actually been some kind of wizard himself.
He's so infused with magic that even if you get his paw, you can have
get wishes. Exactly. Like he was called Peanut the Monkey Wizard.
Yeah. And he had a little, do you think he had that kind of cone hat?
Yeah, he had a cone hat. And
with stars and the moons on it.
Exactly. And you'd give him a date and then he would, cure your leprosy.
You should write like a 1,000-page backstory to this.
About Peanut?
About Peanut, the wizard monkey. Peanut's hand, after he makes the father wishes for 200 pounds, Peanut's hand moves.
Mr. White screams and drops it. And they're like, what is it? He goes, it moved. And it's like, oh, God, that's horrible.
That is pretty nasty. Herbert's like, well, I guess since you made that wish, you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed later and something horrible squatting on top of your wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains, which was kind of a scary thing for him to have said.
Yeah.
And then he takes off. In the last paragraph of part 1, Mr. White is sitting there. It says,
he sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed.
Oh, the simian face he saw was Peanut.
It was. He saw Peanut in the fire. You got to write that book. The long-awaited prequel to The Monkey's Paw.
Long-awaited.
Yeah.
People are just going, God, I wish somebody would just write a prequel to The Monkey's Paw.
I mean, the story's interesting, but, there's so many unanswered questions. So in part 2, Mom and Dad are hanging out. And what time of day is it now? It's the next morning.
Yeah.
There's everything seems like it was silly the night before. It's that kind of thing where oh, God, what were we going on about? It's no big deal. In the light of day, everything, seems so stupid. And I'm sure Herbert will come home and make fun of this.
Yeah, exactly. But then Mrs. White notices that there's this guy that's kind of hanging out in front of the house, and he kind of walks by the gate, and he comes by the gate again, and he walks out, and he's dressed really nice. He's dressed in a very silky outfit with a nice hat and everything like that.
Yeah, he passes the gate 3 times before he finally comes in. There seems to be a theme or a rule of 3s happening in the story itself, because it's in 3 sections. There's 3 wishes. He goes by 3 times. I mean, if you look for it, you can find it in here. It's pretty clear.
And he finally comes in, and Mrs. White thinks that maybe this guy, maybe the wish did come true and he's some kind of wealthy man that's going to give us some money. And she's getting kind of excited by the idea.
Right. I always think it's Publishers Clearinghouse.
Right.
It's Ed McMahon that's going to show up.
Well, he comes in and she gets him some tea, but he's not really saying much at first. And finally, he says he's from the company, Ma and Megan's, where their son works, where Herbert works.
Yeah.
And she's like, what is it? Is anything the matter? And he says, well, and Mr. White is there as well. And the man says, there's been an accident. And he says, well, is he hurt? And he goes, well, he was hurt badly, but he's not in any pain right now. And then she says, oh, thank goodness. Thank God for that. And then she realizes what he meant by that.
Yeah.
And he says, your son was caught in the machinery and he was killed.
Yeah. And the Mr. White says he was the only one left to us. It is hard. And when he said that, maybe they had other children that had passed away before. It was just a tiny little detail.
Yeah,
that
made it extra sad, man.
The man delivers the most biting part of the news.
I was to say that Moore and Meggins disclaim all responsibility, continued the other. They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" £200 was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor.
You know, most of these stories that we've been covering that Lovecraft liked, they all seem to have some fainting involved in them.
Could be, maybe this is a little inspiration for it.
There's some fainting in the yellow wallpaper. I mean, it could be that he made this whole essay about weird tales, but really what he just likes in a story is a good fainting.
Part 3.
The first time I was really aware of the Monkey's Paw, I read it in the novelization of The Goonies.
You mentioned that on the last episode.
Yeah, but that was told more like a campfire tale. And I was surprised in rereading this that some of those aspects were missing. Now, they describe the fact that they're down this long path and kind of out of the way, and there's a gate and you have to come down to their house.
Right.
But as you're telling this as sort of a ghost story, a campfire story, the teller makes kind of a big deal out of that.
Mm-hmm.
The gate opening, like with a creak, and then you hear the person sloshing down the path to the door, and then the knock on the door. So they set when you kind of tell this as a ghost story, you set that up with this visitor coming. Or actually, you set it up with the Sergeant Major coming. Then the visitor comes. And then the third time it happens, you can really play with the sound effects and what that growing anticipation is. The story actually doesn't play with that as much as later theatrical versions did, and the way that it was retold in the Goonies. So that was always my perception of it, is very, almost like a radio drama, very based on sound.
And part 3, this is a few days have passed after this has happened, and they had the funeral. So it's been 10 days after he died, and they are just besides themselves with grief. This is horrible. They're really, really sad.
Yeah, they have a nice bit of characterization there. You know, the story is pretty bare bones. It's really just telling you the tale without too much interference from the author. But I did think there was a nice bit of writing there when it says the old man woke suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. And then there was the sound of subdued weeping coming from the window. It just really paints a nice, dark, sad picture in that tiny moment. You know, I just thought it was nice. But yeah, she the reason she's up is she's upset, but then she suddenly remembers the monkey's paw.
She's like, we have 2 wishes left. Let's wish for him to be alive again. And of course, Mr. White is like, no, it's a coincidence that happened at all. We shouldn't mess with it. Of course, he's going to say that because he doesn't want to take responsibility for that.
Who would? I mean, that's awful. Course.
It's horrible. And he just says, it's silly that we even thought that. It's just leave it be.
Yeah, but she is not having it. She says, go get it and wish.
The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook. He has been dead 10 days, and besides I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?
If he were to come to life, it would not be a pretty sight.
Yeah, he would be a gross zombie guy. Well, I mean, that's an assumption he's making right there. Because that is an obviously supernatural. See, this is a point where I have a point of contention in this story. Mm-hmm. Because in the beginning, the Sergeant Major says, when things happen, they seem like they could be coincidences. So everything should be in the realm of possibility. Now, the fact that he comes back from the dead and he's like a zombie dude, then that totally breaks the rules of the monkey's paw, where it should be, because people can't come back from the dead, especially after they've been ripped apart by a machine.
Well, that might be perhaps where it enters into the realm of the weird tale, because we actually don't know.
We don't know.
Well, okay. So let's finish this up and then talk about that for a second, because I agree with you that was kind of, I was thinking about that as well. Well, she convinces him to do it. She says, wish. Father says it's foolish and wicked, and she orders him to do it. Mm-hmm. So he puts the paw in his hand. He says, I wish my son alive again. And he throws it down again. Obviously, it moved in his hand. And then we get to this sort of horrific part of the story. They're just waiting through the night. And then suddenly they hear a knock at the door.
Yeah.
Now, as I said before, when it's kind of the ghost story thing, first they hear the gate creak open,
Mm-hmm.
Then they hear this kind of dragging sound along the path. And you kind of characterize that, and then whatever gets there and starts knocking. And the way I heard it, the knocking starts, and at first it's light, and then it gets more and more pronounced. And then it sounds like something throwing its entire mass against the door. And I always liked that build, because you've got the mother and father arguing about whether they should open it or not, and kind of struggling with each other. And she's trying to get all the locks undone, and he's trying to find the monkey's paw, because when he dropped it, he didn't know where it went. Right. So they have a little of that, but I every time I'd heard it before, it gets more and more and more dramatic, but it's a wonderful struggle there.
Yeah.
And you're at the edge of your seat, because what are you going to see when she opens that door? She's trying to get the lock undone, and he's saying, for God's sake, don't let it in. And she's like, you're afraid of your own son. Let me go. And she says, I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming. And there's another knock and another knock. And then
the old woman with a sudden wrench broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice strained and panting. "The bolt!" she cried loudly. "Come down! I can't reach it!" But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If only he could find it before the thing outside got in. Perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.
So that's the end of the story.
It is the end, and such a cool ending. I remember being blown away the first time I heard it or read it, an accounting of it, that they don't show you anything.
In fact, I think that's what Lovecraft thinks about it as a weird tale, because nothing supernatural really happens at all.
I mean, is there a coincidental way that this wish could have come true? The argument you were making a second ago that, and the Sergeant Major early says, things happen and it seems like it's a coincidence.
Right, yes.
This would be if he came out of the grave. That's not a coincidence. That's a supernatural event. But is there any way for...
It wasn't actually him that fell into the machine. It was somebody else, because they couldn't recognize his body.
Right.
You know, so, it wasn't me, Father. It was Bill who took over my shift, and he was in early in the day before anybody else came in, and he wore my coveralls and, something like that.
And I've been asleep down in the break room for the last 10 days and didn't even realize anything was going on.
Or I knew that the money was going to come, or maybe he had some. I don't know. There could have been a way that it would have been not supernatural, that it could have played out, and then maybe the bad end of it would be his son would have got arrested for fraud, and then they would have gone to jail or something to that effect. I don't know, but the rules change halfway through the story, where it says he does say things are going to be a coincidence, but then if he's a zombie Herbert, then.
Right.
It's not a coincidence anymore. It's obviously a supernatural thing, but we never do see it. We don't know what happened. So maybe my crazy story or something like it could have happened. Who knows if there's a big zombie monster at the door? Maybe not at all.
Yeah. Your imagination certainly goes crazy with some horrific zombie monster outside of that door, all twisted up. And
I think that's why it's a weird tale, is because it's all of your imagination. There is only a mere suggestion of what it could be.
Yeah.
And then from that, your mind just goes running.
And the fear that you feel is it's something against nature, something that couldn't possibly happen.
Exactly.
Because you never are able to quantify it. It is that touch of the unknown.
Yeah.
I mean, the fear of the unknown.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're right. It works as a fable, and then it also works as a good horror story. It's a good weird tale. Yeah. This one is so tightly woven, it feels like into the fabric of canonical literature.
Absolutely.
Seems like everybody knows the story. And it really is that it's a template for a great, well-paced campfire story. It's got a good scare at the end.
Just the economy of the writing as well. It's really short. He gets so much in that story, so much emotion and so much of a feeling, and it's great. It's a classic.
And it's a little more than, I guess, the Pat message is be careful what you wish for. But I don't know if that's as much of a message. I feel like it's more, there's no easy way to get things.
No.
You can't just wish and then suddenly be wealthy. Or there's a hard path. The easy path brings with it suffering.
It's a gamble. You know, if you risk things, then the risk is going to be folly generally.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how casinos make all their money. People generally lose, and that's just the way it is. But people always hope that maybe I will get the step up on them.
Vegas cracks me up in that everybody participates. Like, it's not just Vegas. You want to pretend that these people, and there's things they do, you know, where you can't get out of the casino. It's difficult. They don't let you know what time of day it is. There's no clocks. You know, everything is very satanically organized within those casinos. But I think it's also the way that people self-report. You know, there are a lot of people who win money and they're walking around the casino talking about it, obviously, because they've had good fortune.
Yep.
The people that lose money don't say a word. They're just walking off white-faced to the shrimp buffet, you know, and, and so we help each other to create an atmosphere in which it seems like everybody's a winner.
Yeah.
And that's not just Vegas. I mean, that goes with so much of life.
And even on a smaller scale, people that gamble will often brag about their wins, even though they've lost much more that day than they've actually won.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You know, I even feel like social networking two-way is like that kind of model. It's the rare person who goes onto those networks and says, you know what, some people do, but day-to-day life is gone away from those kinds of things. But people who are having good fortune are apt to self-report on your Facebook or your Twitter or whatever. So I think there's this horrible negative effect from those social networks where people look at them and they go, everybody's having a wonderful life but me. I mean, look at the food that they're taking great, you know, retro pictures of. Everybody's eating better. Everybody's having more fun. I actually think those things serve to depress people more than they make people feel good. I like the story a lot. I don't really have too much more to say about it because it's not a very complicated story.
No, it isn't. It's simple, it's sweet, and it's really great. I recommend everybody giving it a read. It's, like I said, free. You can download it, and it's short. So, 15, 20 minutes, you're done with it.
Yeah.
And you're a richer person for having read it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing better than simplicity, really. I like something that works on a lot of levels, but just a really great, simple story tastes good.
All right, with that, I'd like to thank our reader today, which we haven't thanked or even mentioned yet in this episode, Paul McLean, who is of Yog Sothoth fame. He is doing the reading for us, and he's also letting me record yet again because my internet isn't hooked up at home yet. I'm over at Innsmouth Studios, and I just want to mention that in my hand, I'm holding The Express Diaries by Nick Marsh. Now, I'm holding this book because Paul produced it. This is a novelization of, they do live role-playing game recordings. That's a big thing they do at Yog Sothoth. And it's a Call of Cthulhu story, the horror on the Orient Express. And then they wrote a novel based on it. And it's a hardcover. They did like a fundraiser, like a Kickstarter thing. Yeah. They got all the money together. They did it. It's a beautiful book. It has all these really amazing illustrations and cutouts and things like that. I haven't read it yet, but I've read some other stuff that Nick has done, and it's great. And it's available on their website. We'll put a link, and I recommend it. Just looking at it visually, it's beautiful. Next week, I'll tell you if it's good or not.
Okay, cool. And everybody should pick up that book. I can't wait to have a look at it myself. Next week, we're going to cover a story that we talked about a couple weeks ago called The Upper Berth by F. Marion Crawford. I don't know anything about it, really. It's from the 1890s. It's another public domain thing. You can see it online or you can get it on a Kindle. The Upper Berth by F. Marion Crawford. I'm looking forward to reading that and discussing that. Yeah. And then the week after that for our free show, I had mentioned that Dickens wrote some ghost stories. Lovecraft mentioned it. in the intro to Supernatural Horror, but he didn't specify any one of them. I had talked about this courtroom ghost story that he wrote that I was familiar with, but so many people wrote in to say, no, you've got to read The Signal Man, which is a classic Dickens ghost story. So I haven't read it, even though a lot of people seem to be aware of it.
Neither have I, so let's do it.
We're going to do that one for our free show. So coming up next is The Upper Berth by F. Marion Crawford. After that, The Signal Man by Charles Dickens. And that's going to be the next two. Both of those are free. So I hope you'll read them in preparation for it. I guess we probably should.
We should as well. One last thing I want to mention is my Kickstarter, Transreality, it hit its goal.
Congratulations, Chris. That's so awesome, man.
I'm so excited. I can't wait to keep working on it and finish it and do all the things I need to do to make a completed graphic novel. Yeah. So the Kickstarter is still going on for another week. So if you want to get in on it and buy a copy or somehow participate in some of the higher level stuff, you still have time to do it because it's not fully written. I'm going to make some changes because some people at level $75, if you put in $75, your name will be in the story somewhere. Either it'll be like the name of a company or the name of a character, whatever. So I'm going to have to go back and do a little finagling to get all these people's names into the story somehow. Or you can even, if a higher level, you can actually be in the story visually as well. But that's it. It's going to happen no matter what. Yep. But if you want to be a part of it, you still can. There's only about a week left.
All right, check it out. We got some time left, so please go over to that Kickstarter, check it out, give them some dough, try and get your way into the book. Or just ensure that it's going to have a larger print run, which would be a little more money would help with that, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, that's all we got for this week. Check us out next week for The Upper Berth. I'm Chad Pfeiffer.
I'm Chris Lackey.
And this has been the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast.
At hppodcraft.com.